Now, it's kind of hard to understand because the verse is a bit long, but it's basically saying that when Esau and Jacob was in the womb of Rebekah, they were still in the womb, so they still didn't sin. They haven't done anything good and they haven't done anything bad. But God, for his redemptive history, already chose one of these children to further his redemptive works, to further and continue the covenant of the torch. So this decision was not influenced by the thoughts of man, but it was the absolute choice and decision of God. Therefore, God tells Rebekah in Romans chapter 9, verse 12, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger. This is recorded in Genesis chapter 25, verse 23, when Rebekah was pregnant, and God tells Rebekah, hey, the older within you is going to serve the younger. I have already chosen this. God already chose this. What does it mean that it has already been chosen by God? It means that that is what is right. The order of their birth is not important. In Genesis chapter 25, verse 28, who does Isaac love more? Isaac loved Esau more, his older son, but Rebekah loved Jacob. But Isaac, whether he loved Esau or whether he loved Jacob, was not important. The important thing was that God had already chosen one out of two, that the older will serve the younger. It became truth. It became history. In Romans chapter 9, verse 13, God says, just as it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. This is the absolute righteousness. The righteousness of God's decision and choice. Because God is saying, hey, I love Jacob, and Esau I hate. God has already made this decision. So what can we say against that decision? Is it not righteous that God chose Jacob? No, that is righteousness. When we look at the information thus far, the timeline doesn't match up. It might seem unfair for these people, for Jacob and Esau. However, according to that one fact that God has made this decision, all other facts, it does not matter. We ourselves we may not understand or we may not like what we're hearing today. Why? Because it may seem like I'm saying that we don't have a choice in anything. But when we look at the relationship between the Creator and the creation, this is the order. This is the correct order. No matter how smart we are, no matter how much authority, no matter how much wealth we might have. If I invest my money and build a building, or I have a lot of authority, so I do something good. People out in the world, they may think that these are the things that you must do in life, that these are the accomplishments that people revere. But none of these things matter before God's decision and choice. When we look at Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, they put their decisions ahead of God's command. They chose the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They believed and thought that they could be like God, that they can know the same things as God. So they made the decision and went against God's decision and command and choice. We are all living in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, we are always fighting the fight of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What is the fight of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? It is our topic for today. God's decision is always correct. It is believing this or not believing this. It is the fight between these two thoughts. That is what righteousness is. God, through the Bible, is showing us what He has chosen, His choices and His decisions. He is showing us through the Bible. We see this every single day. He chose His one and only Son, Jesus Christ, and sent Him to us. And He told us to choose the path of the cross. Therefore, the path of the cross is righteousness. And that is the only path that must be in front of us, that we must walk. To walk the path of the cross, to eat of the tree of life. So, what can we do before God's decision and choice? We as creation must bow down in humbleness and recognize God's choices, accept His decisions. And even though we are lacking in many ways, God has given us the grace to believe in Jesus Christ, to choose Jesus Christ. And what is thankful is that we have the proof of that decision. You know, our church is a blessing, right? We live and come to this church. And what blessing do we receive? We receive the little book, the redemptive word. We are eating it every single day. And eating this every single day is proof of God's righteousness. I pray that you may give thanks to the fact that you're eating of the tree of life every single day. And I pray that you may all enter into the kingdom of heaven with this faith. And I bless you in the name of the Lord. Secondly, what type of posture must we have? The posture of waiting for God. When we look at verse 15, Exodus chapter 33, verse 9, when we look at today's scripture reading in verse 15, it uses Exodus chapter 33, verse 19. Exodus 33:19 says, "And he said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim the name of the Lord before you, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show compassion to whom I will show compassion." So, this is when Moses asked God, "God, please show me your glory." And this is God's reply. And Apostle Paul uses this scripture because God blesses us. God shows us compassion only according to His decision and His choices. God's decision and God's choices do not and is not affected by the efforts of mankind. When we look at Romans chapter 9, verse 16, it says this. "So then, it does not depend on the person who wants it, nor the one who runs, but on God, who has mercy." God does not accept our prayers because we want it. because we plan it, because we earnestly ask for it. Man's reliance, man's effort does not matter before God. It does not change God's decision. It does not change God's reasoning and 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 God's choices. And that is why it is the covenant of God. That is why, we continuously hear the word covenant, right? But what is a characteristic of a covenant? A covenant is one-sided. God's covenant is one-sided. God gives it to us. So the covenant that was made between us and God, we call it what? We call it the covenant of grace. Why do we call it the covenant of grace? Because grace comes from God. It comes from only God and from the decisions of God. So, in order to better understand, why did God choose Pharaoh and put him in the middle of the redemptive history? If Pharaoh didn't exist, then the Israelites could have, come out of Egypt a little bit quicker, right? They would have had an easier time, during the Exodus, right? But just as I said today, none of these things can be judged by us, by man. Why? Because God had already willed something through Pharaoh. It's recorded in today's scripture reading. Romans chapter 9 verse 17. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, "For this very reason I raised you up, in order to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed throughout the earth." So even a wicked and evil leader like Pharaoh is used to show and for the righteousness and for the glory of God. Because Pharaoh was chosen and he was put there in the position of leadership, God was able to perform the miracles, the 10 commandments, the 10 plagues. And through Pharaoh, God willed it so that his name is maybe proclaimed far and wide. That is why Pharaoh was put in his place. Through the 10 plagues, the foreshadowing of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice, splitting of the Red Sea, there were many, many precious moments in the redemptive history that happened through and because of Pharaoh. How can we understand God's great plan? We can't. When we look at verse 18, today's scripture reading, everything is in the hand of God. God is the one who hardens the heart. God is the one that brings peace. Let's look at Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was used by God. God put Nebuchadnezzar in his position of power for the captivity, for Israel. And when we look at John chapter 6 verses 70, Jesus answered them, "Did I myself not choose you, the 12? And yet one of you is a devil." Now he meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, for he, one of the 12, was going to betray him. Jesus himself chose the 12 disciples. He made that decision. And one of them was Judas Iscariot. And Jesus knows that he was wicked, that he was a devil. But why did he include Judas into his 12 disciples? Because he needs to walk the path of the cross. Someone has to betray him. And that is why he let Judas into and part of his 12 disciples. God works in ways that we cannot understand in order to fulfill the redemptive history. He even uses the devil. He even uses the wicked. Then when we apply this in our life, what type of grace can we obtain from this fact? Our life Is our life like the Pharaoh? Is our life like Nebuchadnezzar? Is our life like that of Judas Iscariot?